Hey guys, this is National Master Kevin Yang back at it with another video. So this one is against Fupalicious, always strong contender who's ready to bring a fight whenever. Let's get to it. It's another English opening, and this time I opt for a King's Indian setup. Our friend Fupalicious goes for. So usually I'm going to interrupt myself, but the King's Indian is usually like this: e4, d6, knight f3, castles, bishop e2, e5, castles, knight c6, and after this happens, it's a fiesta, a jambalaya everywhere. c5, b4, just blah blah. And sometimes, eventually black goes yarg like this on the king's side. So that's the King's Indian for you there. A lot of good players play the King's Indian, and it's not a bad opening if you want to go for a win. So e4, d6, bishop g2, and here I play the basic setup, but our friend Fupalicious does not go for d4. He opts for d3, and this is completely fine, right? Creating this setup. And what I do is I play h6 because I recognize that, okay, maybe our friend Fupalicious wants to play bishop g5, take on f6, and plan a knight on d5. I play h6 to stop that. But f4 comes, and at this point in the game, I was a little bit troubled by what I saw. And it mainly came from the fact that f5 and g4 and h4, it seemed like it was coming much faster than I had wanted it to. So I was like, ugh, if I play bishop e6, f5, and then bishop g7, knight d5, and all of a sudden, I'm not feeling so well, right? Maybe I might be a little worse, but it's not trending in the right direction. So I decided to take on f4. And after bishop takes f4, I was actually anticipating pawn takes f4. And I was like, what do I do? Because I kind of felt like pawn takes was the best capture. I just didn't know how to approach it because I knew that f5 was coming. So if I play knight h5, maybe white plays f5. But here I was intending queen h4 followed by bishop to e5. That was my goal, and I was like, I'm gonna go with that. But our friend played bishop takes f4. And immediately I was like, how do I do this, right? Do I play knight h5 and f5? Do I play g5? Do I play knight g4? What do I do, right? And I played knight g4. And the reason is because I want to plan a knight on d4, but I also want to play g5 and have the flexibility of going back to g6. So our friend Fupalicious played h3, and here I briefly considered the move g5 because I had known that, okay, if g5 happens, the bishop can go back to d2, but I get back to e5 and I have a direct threat on the pawn. Now, if bishop c1 happens, I'm going to go back to e5, I'm going to go back to g6, I'm going to maybe play g4, who knows, right? But the critical variation is what happens if white takes, right? Then pawn takes, and if knight takes, I have queen to g5, threatening the pawn, or knight to e5. And the other move is rook takes f4, and here I could play either queen to g5, or I could play knight to e5, both of which make an attack on that g4 pawn. So, at this point in the game, bishop d2 was played. No, I'm just hallucinating. At this point in the game, knight g5 was played, And here I said, okay, well, you cannot play d4 because I take that pawn on c4. So you can play b3. Good move by Fupalicious. Another move I would have thought about is maybe like rook to c1. Maybe would have thought about knight to d5. But b3 is an interesting move, right? It's preparing d4. So I played g5. I needed to give my knight that space. And after bishop e3, I played f5. Now this is an inaccuracy due to the variation that Fupalicious steps down to. And from here, Fupalicious plays great until that one last blunder, but I won't talk about it just yet. Now I want to say why this move is bad. And the reason why this move is bad is because of the continuation. So I'll show you. But I'll show you what I should have done. What I should have done is played hg4. Beg my pardon. After h4, I should have sacrificed, followed by knight to e5, followed by bishop to g4, and I should have taken advantage of the weaknesses that were on these light squares. But I didn't think that actively. I thought f5, and after pawn takes and bishop takes and d4, I was thinking this position might be okay. But as it turns out later on, it's not so good, because after d4, knight g6, takes, our friend Fupalicious finds a really good move, g4, right? And at this point, I'm very limited in squares. If I play bishop e6, there's a fork that comes on the board. Bam, bam, not looking good for me. If bishop d7, which is what I played in the game, it's okay, but my bishop really becomes passive now. There's nothing I can do. So now I'm going to expose the problems with this position. So I have a few problems with this position. The problem is that the queen cannot develop very easily, and I'm going to tell you why. If the queen ever comes to e7, the knight comes onto d5 and threatens c7, protects the bishop, and the queen has to retreat back, right? So the queen can't go to e7. If the queen goes to e8, there's still knight d5. So the queen has to sort of guard d5. At the same time, we look at this position, queen c2, queen d2, bishop d5. White has the activity advantage here. Getting the bishop out to e4 maybe, getting the bishop out to d5, getting the knight to d5. I mean, white has all the play in this position. This bishop's horrible. This bishop's not doing much because it's limited in activity. This knight is sort of stuck. And this knight maybe has like one good square. This second good square is protected by white's pieces. So after queen c2, I play knight h4, and bishop f2 is what I would consider a slight mistake. So what I would say in this position is, you could play bishop to e4. You could also play bishop to d5. And the reason why I say keep the bishop is because if we just simulate this, bishop to e4, the knight is fatefully trapped. There are no squares. Knight to f3 runs into rook takes f3. The knight is gone from the game. It's stuck. I could play knight b4 maybe, but queen d2 and the knight is still stuck. So at this point in the game, I was feeling very uncomfortable. Knight h4. I hated my position because, like I explained before, my queen doesn't have a good time of coming out because there's knight d5. So I need to get something together with bishop e6, knight e7, and c6, because there's also this diagonal. And I also have to think about the fork, so there's so many things on my mind right now. But after bishop f2, now I have the choice of eliminating that bishop. I have the choice of playing h5 and trying to break free on the king side. Now the only reason why I didn't play knight takes g2 is because I had some sort of fear that my queen, not my queen, my king side would get a little bit too vulnerable. And I was thinking about something like this. Not at this exact moment, but I sort of had this internal feeling that I would just be too exposed to play a position. Because this knight can hop on here. The bishop can coordinate itself. So the idea of thinking about this is a little bit scary. So in the game, I played knight f3 check, thinking if you play king h1, I'm going to maybe take on d4. I'm going to maybe think about playing h5, but I didn't know. I was thinking about taking at d4 on first. Knight takes d4, but the problem is, after bishop takes and queen to g6, white has bishop to e4, and it's not looking so good for me again. Maybe I could play rook f4, but don't forget, bishop d5, or threatening queen g8, or knight d5, right? So things were not looking so great for me. So after king h1, I had to play h5. I had to break something open here. But at the time, I didn't quite remember, or I didn't know much. So I was like, okay, knight f3, bishop takes, rook takes. So at this point, I was pretty satisfied because now I can bring my queen to f8, now I can bring my rook to e8, and suddenly I'm sprouting with activity. At the same time, I also eliminated one of white's most powerful bishops. So after king g2, rook f7, queen g6, venturing into the territory, but there's no supporting bishop to come to e4. This is where queen to e8 comes in handy, because we set up a little barrier, and once we slide that barrier across, we might be able to get that queen. So I tested Fupalicious's tactical knowledge. I wanted to see if he sensed it or not. And our friend Fupalicious played rook to e1. I took on f2 with a check and a discovery, got the queen, and I got the dub. But overall, it was a good game by Fupalicious and not a really good game by me. I mean, I didn't do very well in anticipating the f4 and f5 stuff. I mean, it was a little bit ugly for my g5 and my f5, especially because afterwards I gave our friend a lot of activity, right? My bishops were horrible, my knights weren't in great spots. I didn't have the activity needed to, but bishop f2 helped me a lot. Eliminate one of the bishops was a key of mine. Knight f3 was a decent move, but the thing is that at this point on, I got my activity. I got to bring the queen out. I got to bring the rook out, as opposed to maybe like not that long ago, my queen, if went here, knight d5. If went here, knight d5. Same thing. I was just haunted by the idea that I didn't have any activity. But thank goodness, at the very end, a tactical shot did it. Just a little bit of a trick. Sometimes you just gotta get a little bit lucky. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.